My sister manipulated my parents, forcing them through deception to demand thousands of dollars from me every month for my father's treatment. But after I completely stopped the payments, my sister begged me to give her money to pay off a loan. So here I am, 32 years old, sitting in my cramped Manhattan apartment, staring at my laptop screen after another 12-hour day debugging someone else's terrible code. Name's Mike, and I work in IT here in New York City. Yeah, I know, another tech guy with problems, but stick with me on this one. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. Mom's voice sounded different, shaky in a way that immediately put me on edge. She told me Dad was having heart problems, serious ones, the kind that required expensive treatments, specialists, procedures that insurance barely covered. My parents have been living on Dad's pension and Social Security, barely scraping by even in normal times. Without hesitation, I told her I'd help. Family comes first, right? That's how I was raised in our small Ohio town, before I moved to the big city. I started sending $3,000 every month, sometimes more when Mom mentioned additional tests or treatments. It felt good to finally give back to the people who raised me, who supported my dreams of working in tech. Those first few months, I was proud of myself. Here I was, the successful son, swooping in to save the day. I'd call Mom twice a week to check on Dad's progress, asking about his appointments, his medication, how he was feeling. She'd give me updates, some days better, some worse, but always fighting. I made a point to visit every couple of months, driving the 6 hours from Manhattan to their little house in Columbus. Dad looked tired, sure, but he'd always been a tough guy. Worked construction for 40 years, never complained about anything. Seeing him a bit worn down didn't immediately raise red flags for me. During these visits, I'd help around the house, fixing the leaky faucet Dad couldn't get to anymore, cleaning the gutters, basic maintenance stuff. Mom would cook my favorite meals, and we'd sit around talking about everything except the medical bills. I figured they didn't want to burden me with all the depressing details. But my sister Lisa started acting weird around this time. We'd always been close growing up, just 2 years apart, partners in crime during our childhood. But now, whenever I called check-in, she seemed distant, almost cold. Her responses were short, clipped, like she was in a hurry to get off the phone. When I'd ask about Dad's treatment or how the money was being used, she'd get defensive. Lisa would snap at me for asking too many questions, saying I was being controlling, and that Mom was handling everything fine. This was completely unlike her. She'd never been secretive or hostile with me before. One evening, I was at my parents' house helping Dad organize his medications when I overheard Lisa talking to Mom in the kitchen. She was saying something about not telling me all the details, that I was worrying too much and it wasn't good for anyone. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed me walking past. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Lisa was just trying to protect me from the worst of Dad's condition. Families do that sometimes, right? Shield each other from the really scary stuff. I convinced myself it was just her way of being caring. The monthly transfers became routine. I'd get my paycheck, pay my rent and bills, then immediately send the money to Mom. $3,000 here, sometimes for when she mentioned unexpected costs. It was a significant chunk of my income, but I lived modestly anyway. My tiny studio apartment, takeout dinners, and occasional drinks with co-workers. I didn't need much. Mom would always thank me profusely over the phone, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. She'd tell me how much it meant to have a son like me, how proud she was of what I'd accomplished. Those conversations made the financial sacrifice feel worthwhile. But something kept nagging at me. Dad didn't seem to be getting significantly better or worse. For someone with supposed serious heart problems requiring expensive ongoing treatment, his condition seemed remarkably stable. He was tired, sure, but he was still doing light yard work, still driving to the grocery store, still watching his beloved Ohio State football games every Saturday. I started paying more attention during my visits, looking for signs of a serious medical condition that was costing thousands every month. Prescription bottles, medical equipment, appointment reminders on the fridge. The usual stuff you'd expect to see in a house where someone was battling a major health crisis. There were some medications, but nothing that looked particularly serious or expensive. No oxygen tanks, no special dietary restrictions, no visiting nurses. Dad would joke about getting old, but he never seemed to be in any real distress or pain. He'd even help me with the heavier household repairs, something that struck me as odd for someone with a serious heart condition. During one visit in early fall, I noticed Lisa had been spending more time at the house. She'd always been the sibling who stayed closer to home, working various retail jobs and living in a small apartment across town. But lately, she seemed to be around constantly, almost like she was monitoring my visits. She'd hover whenever I talked to Mom about finances, jumping into conversations with unnecessary details about Dad's supposed treatment schedule. Lisa would emphasize how complicated everything was, how many different doctors they were seeing, how expensive all the tests were becoming. It felt rehearsed somehow, like she was trying too hard to convince me. The strangest part was how she'd change the subject whenever I suggested visiting Dad's cardiologist myself or offering to help navigate insurance claims. For someone dealing with a family medical crisis, she seemed surprisingly resistant to additional help or involvement. I started noticing other small things, too. Bills and paperwork left on the kitchen counter had Lisa's name on them more often than Dad's. Insurance statements, medical forms, even some receipts from pharmacies, all addressed to her instead of my parents. When I asked about it, Mom would quickly explain that Lisa was helping coordinate Dad's care since she had more free time. That explanation made sense on the surface, but something about the whole situation felt off. The pieces weren't fitting together the way they should for a genuine medical emergency. But I pushed down my doubts, telling myself I was being paranoid and ungrateful. These were my parents, my sister. They wouldn't lie to me about something this serious. Looking back now, I realize I want to believe them so badly that I ignored obvious warning signs. I want to be the successful son who saved his family, the tech guy who made it big in New York and could solve everyone's problems with money. It felt good to be needed, to be the hero of the story. But heroes, I was about to learn, are often just people who haven't figured out they're being played yet. 3 months into sending money home, I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break when something caught my eye. Lisa had posted photos from what looked like a pretty expensive night out, some trendy steakhouse in Columbus that I knew cost at least $60 per person. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, designer looking, definitely not from Target. The next photo showed her standing next to a shiny Honda Civic in what appeared to be a dealership lot. The caption read something about new beginnings and being grateful for opportunities. My stomach dropped a little. When did my sister, who'd been working retail and supposedly helping with Dad's medical expenses, get a new car? I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe she'd gotten a promotion, or maybe the car was used and just looked new in the photo. People lease cars all the time, right? The payments could be reasonable. But something about the timing felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Over the next few weeks, I found myself checking her social media more frequently than I'd care to admit. More restaurant photos, pictures of shopping bags from places like Nordstrom and Michael Kors, weekend trips to Cincinnati and Cleveland that she'd never mentioned during our brief phone conversations. This was the same sister who'd been complaining about struggling to make rent just 6 months earlier. The same Lisa who'd asked me for a small loan to fix her old Corolla's transmission problems. Now, she was living like someone with comfortable disposable income, posting about wine tastings and concert tickets. Meanwhile, every time I called home, Mom would mention how expensive Dad's treatments were getting, how grateful they were for my help, how they didn't know what they'd do without my monthly contributions. The guilt was real. Here I was, questioning my sister's spending while my father supposedly battled serious health issues. During my next visit home in November, I decided to pay closer attention to the details. The house looked exactly the same as always. Same old furniture, same outdated kitchen, same worn carpet in the living room. If thousands of dollars were flowing through this household every month, there was no evidence of it in their living situation. Dad seemed his usual self, maybe a bit more tired than in previous years, but nothing dramatic. He was still watching his sports, still complaining about the neighbor's loud dog, still insisting on doing his own grocery shopping, because he didn't trust Mom to buy the right brand of coffee. I started looking more carefully at the paperwork scattered around the house. Medical bills, insurance statements, appointment reminders, all the usual stuff you'd expect. But something struck me as odd about the patterns. Many of the documents had Lisa's name as a contact person, which Mom had explained as Lisa helping coordinate care. But then I noticed bills for things that seemed unrelated to Dad's heart condition, physical therapy appointments that Dad never mentioned attending, prescription receipts for medications I'd never seen him take, specialist consultations with doctors whose names never came up in our conversations about his treatment. When I asked Dad directly about some of these appointments, he looked confused for a moment before Mom or Lisa would jump in to explain. They'd talk about how many different doctors were involved, how complex the treatment plan was, how hard it was for Dad to keep track of everything. Fair enough, medical care can be overwhelming, especially for older patients. But Dad wasn't showing any signs of cognitive decline. He could still beat me at chess, still remembered obscure details about baseball games from 30 years ago, still managed his own checking account and paid utility bills. Why couldn't he remember basic details about his own medical treatment? The breaking point came when I offered to attend one of his cardiology appointments with him. I figured it would help me understand his condition better and maybe give Mom a break from all the coordination work. Lisa immediately shot down the idea, saying the appointments were routine and it would just be boring for me. Mom agreed a little too quickly, explaining that Dad got nervous when too many people came to his appointments. This was news to me. Dad had never been anxious about medical visits before. Throughout my childhood, he'd been the calm one during family medical crises, the guy who drove us to the emergency room without breaking a sweat. I started doing what any suspicious person would do. I began investigating online. I looked up the specialists whose names appeared on various bills and documents around the house. Some of them were legitimate doctors in Columbus, but others were harder to verify. A few seemed to specialize in conditions that had nothing to do with cardiology. The insurance statements were another puzzle. Dad's Medicare and supplemental insurance seemed to be covering most of the major expenses. Yet Mom kept mentioning out-of-pocket costs that require my monthly contributions. When I asked for specific examples, she'd mention copays and deductibles, which sounded reasonable but never seemed to add up to thousands of dollars per month. Lisa's lifestyle upgrade was becoming harder to ignore. She'd started posting photos from what looked like a much nicer apartment, complete with new furniture and modern appliances. Her old beat-up Corolla had definitely been replaced by that Honda Civic, and she was dressing better than I'd ever seen her dress. During family phone calls, she'd make casual mentions of things like yoga classes, regular salon appointments, and weekend getaways. None of this matched the financial picture she'd been painting just months earlier when she was supposedly struggling to make ends meet. I found myself in an uncomfortable position, suspicious of my own family, but lacking concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. Maybe Lisa had gotten a better job that she hadn't mentioned. Maybe she received some kind of windfall or loan that was funding her improved lifestyle. Maybe Dad's medical situation was more complex than I understood. But the nagging doubts were growing stronger. The inconsistencies were piling up, and my natural tendency as a tech guy to analyze systems and spot problems was kicking into overdrive. Something about this whole situation wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The worst part was the guilt I felt for even questioning them. These were the people who'd raised me, supported my dreams, celebrated my successes. If I was wrong about my suspicions, I'd be the ungrateful son who doubted his family during a medical crisis. But if I was right, I'd been played for a fool while my father's supposed illness was being used to fund my sister's lifestyle upgrade. Either way, I needed to find out the truth. The monthly transfers were adding up to a significant amount of money, and I deserved to know where it was really going. More importantly, if Dad was actually sick, I wanted to make sure he was getting the best possible care. And if he wasn't sick, well, that was a conversation we needed to have. I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. By December, I'd sent over $20,000 to help with Dad's supposed medical expenses, and the inconsistencies were driving me crazy. So I decided to do what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I took a long weekend and drove home unannounced. My plan was simple. Show up, ask direct questions, and get some real answers. No more vague explanations about complicated treatment plans or coordinated care. I wanted to see medical records, talk to doctors, and understand exactly what was happening with Dad's health. The first stop was Dad's supposed cardiologist. I'd found a name on several bills, Dr. Patterson at Columbus Heart Specialists. I called their office and explained that I was concerned about my father's treatment and wanted to schedule a consultation to discuss his case. The receptionist was helpful and professional, asking for Dad's full name and date of birth to pull up his records. After a few minutes on hold, she came back with news that hit me like a punch to the gut. They had no record of my father as a patient. No appointments, no treatments, no billing history. Nothing. Dr. Patterson had never seen or treated my dad for anything related to heart problems or any other medical condition. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I sat in my car outside the medical building, trying to process what I just learned. Either this was a massive clerical error, or someone in my family had been lying to me for months about Dad's medical treatment. I called 2 other specialists whose names had appeared on various documents and bills around the house. Same story. No record of my father as a patient. One office manager was particularly helpful, explaining that they specialize in orthopedic surgery and had never treated anyone with Dad's name for any condition, heart-related or otherwise. The drive to my parents' house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My mind was racing with possible explanations, most of them involving some level of deception from people I trusted completely. I rehearsed different ways to bring up what I discovered, trying to find an approach that wouldn't immediately put everyone on the defensive. When I walked to the front door, Mom was genuinely surprised to see me. Dad was in his usual spot on the couch, watching a basketball game and looking perfectly healthy. Lisa wasn't there, which was probably for the best given what I was about to discuss. I decided to be direct. Sitting down across from my parents, I explained that I'd been calling around to Dad's doctors because I wanted to better understand his condition and treatment options. The color drained from Mom's face almost immediately. Dad looked confused, asking what doctors I was talking about. Mom started stammering about how there must be some mistake, how medical offices sometimes have problems with their record-keeping systems. But her explanations sounded hollow and desperate. Dad, meanwhile, was looking back and forth between us like he was trying to understand what conversation he'd missed. That's when the truth finally came out. With tears streaming down her face, Mom admitted that Dad didn't have serious heart problems. There was no expensive treatment, no team of specialists, no mounting medical bills. The whole thing had been fabricated to justify asking for money that was actually going to support Lisa's lifestyle changes. Dad was shocked. Apparently, he'd known I was sending money to help the family, but he thought it was just general financial assistance because of their tight budget. He had no idea that a supposed medical crisis was being used as the reason for my monthly contributions. The details were even worse than I'd imagined. Lisa had been the mastermind behind the deception, convincing Mom that I wouldn't help the family unless there was a crisis that justified the expense. She created fake medical bills, researched real doctors and specialists to make the documents look authentic, and coached Mom on what to say during our phone conversations. My sister had been using the money to lease a new car, upgrade her apartment, and fund a lifestyle that her retail job could never support. She convinced Mom that this was temporary, that she'd pay everything back once she got established in a better career, that it wasn't really lying because the family did need financial help. Mom kept apologizing, explaining how Lisa had made it all sound reasonable at first, just a small lie to get some help during a tough period. But the deception had grown and become more elaborate over time as Lisa's expenses increased, and my monthly contributions became essential to maintaining her new lifestyle. The most heartbreaking part was learning that Mom had been uncomfortable with the lies from the beginning, but Lisa had convinced her that telling the truth would mean losing my support entirely. My sister had painted me as someone who would only help in dramatic circumstances, not someone who might assist family members with ordinary financial struggles. I was furious, hurt, and disappointed all at the same time. The people I'd trusted most in the world had been systematically lying to me for months, taking advantage of my love and concern for Dad's well-being. The money itself wasn't even the main issue. It was a betrayal. the manipulation, the complete disregard for my feelings and trust. Dad was equally upset, but his anger was directed at Mom and Lisa for involving him unknowingly in their scheme. He'd been wondering why I'd been asking so many questions about his health and medical appointments that didn't exist. Now everything made sense, and he was embarrassed and angry about being used as a prop in their deception. When Lisa finally arrived at the house that evening, the confrontation was intense. She walked into a room full of tension and immediately knew that her scheme had been exposed. But instead of showing remorse or apologizing, she became defensive and argumentative. She accused me of being controlling and suspicious, claiming that the family had needed help, and this was the only way to get it. According to Lisa, I was too judgmental and successful to understand real financial struggles, so they'd had to create a crisis that would motivate me to contribute. The conversation lasted hours, with Lisa alternating between defiance and attempts at justification. She claimed she'd always intended to pay the money back, that she'd been planning to tell me the truth once she got established in a better financial situation. But she couldn't explain why she continued expanding her expenses instead of saving money to repay what she'd taken. She also couldn't explain why she chose to deceive me rather than simply asking for help with her legitimate financial needs. The truth was becoming clear. Lisa had wanted to upgrade her lifestyle without the accountability that would come with a straightforward loan or gift from her successful brother. By the end of that weekend, the family dynamics had completely changed. Dad was hurt and angry about being unknowingly involved in the deception. Mom was devastated about the lies, but also defensive about her decision to go along with Lisa's plan. And Lisa remained largely unrepentant, treating the whole situation like an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a serious betrayal of trust. I drove back to New York feeling like I discovered that my family were strangers. The people I'd thought I knew, the relationships I'd valued most, had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The question now was whether we could rebuild something honest from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The ride back to Manhattan was brutal. 8 hours of highway driving gave me way too much time to think about everything that had just unraveled. I kept replaying conversations in the past several months, seeing all the red flags I'd missed, all the times I'd given them the benefit of the doubt when I should have been asking harder questions. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. The monthly money transfers stopped immediately. I wasn't going to fund Lisa's lifestyle upgrade anymore, but I also wasn't ready to completely cut off my family. What I needed was a way to rebuild trust and establish some ground rules for any future financial help. The phone calls started almost immediately. Mom called first, crying and apologizing, begging me not to abandon the family over Lisa's mistakes. She kept emphasizing that they still needed help, that their fixed income really wasn't enough to cover all their expenses, that the medical crisis might have been fabricated, but their financial struggles were real. I listened to her explanations, but I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget. Trust, once broken, doesn't magically repair itself because someone says they're sorry. I needed to see real changes in how my family communicated with me before I consider resuming any kind of financial support. Lisa took a different approach. Her calls were defensive and angry, accusing me of being vindictive and punishing the whole family because I couldn't handle being wrong about something. According to her version of events, I'd forced them into deception by being too rigid and judgmental to help with ordinary financial problems. She kept insisting that her intentions had been good, that she'd always planned to pay the money back, that the whole situation was just a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. But she couldn't explain why she continued expanding her expenses instead of working toward financial independence. Dad stayed mostly quiet during these family discussions, but I could tell he was struggling with his own feelings about what had happened. He'd been used as an unwitting prop in Lisa's scheme, and a supposed medical crisis had become the centerpiece of months of lies. The whole situation had damaged his relationships with everyone involved. During one of our conversations, he mentioned feeling foolish for not realizing what was happening. He'd wondered why I'd been asking so many specific questions about doctors and treatments, but he'd assumed I was just being thorough and caring. Now he felt like he should have connected the dots sooner. After a week of these emotional phone calls, I decided to lay out my terms for moving forward. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone or holding grudges forever, But I also wasn't going to return to the previous dynamic where I sent money based on vague explanations and emotional appeals. If they wanted my financial help in the future, everything had to be completely transparent. Real bills for real expenses, detailed explanations of what the money was for, and regular updates on how it was being used. No more coordinated stories. No more Lisa managing information flow. No more treating me like an ATM that dispensed cash when the right emotional buttons were pushed. Mom agreed to these conditions immediately, promising that there would be no more lies or deception. She seemed genuinely remorseful about what had happened and eager to rebuild our relationship on a more honest foundation. Her willingness to accept accountability gave me some hope that we could eventually repair the damage. Lisa's response was entirely different. She rejected my conditions as controlling and unreasonable, claiming that requiring detailed documentation and regular updates was treating her like a child. According to Lisa, family members should help each other without imposing bureaucratic requirements or demanding receipts for every expense. The argument that followed was probably the most intense conflict Lisa and I had ever had. She accused me of using money to control the family, of being too successful to understand real financial struggles, of turning a simple mistake into a relationship-ending crisis. Every criticism felt designed to make me feel guilty for establishing boundaries. But I'd learned something important from this whole experience. Guilt is often a tool used by people who don't want to be held accountable for their actions. Lisa's anger wasn't really about my conditions. It was about losing access to an easy source of funding that came with no strings attached. The conversation ended with Lisa threatening to cut off contact with me entirely if I didn't return to sending money without questions. She painted this as a choice between having a relationship with her or maintaining my new requirements for financial transparency. In her mind, I had to pick one or the other. This ultimatum backfired completely. Instead of making me feel pressure to give in to her demands, it clarified something important about our relationship. Lisa was only interested in staying close to me if that closeness came with financial benefits. When those benefits were threatened by accountability measures, the relationship became expendable. Over the following weeks, the family dynamics continued to shift. Mom and Dad accepted my conditions and even seemed relieved to have everything out in the open. They provided detailed information about their actual expenses and financial needs, which turned out to be much more modest than the amounts I'd been sending during the fake medical crisis. Lisa, meanwhile, followed through on her threat to limit contact. She stopped calling, responding to my messages, or participating in family conversations when I was involved. She seemed determined to prove that maintaining her pride was more important than maintaining our relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me. The sister who claimed that lying was necessary to preserve family relationships was now willing to destroy those same relationships rather than accept responsibility for her actions. Her behavior was revealing the true priorities that had driven her decisions all along. I found myself feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sad because I'd lost a close relationship I thought I had with Lisa, but relieved because I no longer had to navigate the constant deception and manipulation that had apparently been part of our interactions for months. By the end of December, a new normal was starting to emerge. I resumed sending modest amounts of money to help Mom and Dad with legitimate expenses, but now everything was documented and transparent. They sent me copies of bills, explained what the money was for, and provided updates on how it was helping them. The amounts were smaller than what I'd been sending during the fake medical crisis, but they were sustainable and based on real needs rather than fabricated emergencies. More importantly, the money came with honest communication and mutual respect rather than lies and manipulation. Lisa continued to maintain her distance, apparently hoping that I'd eventually cave in and return to the previous arrangement where she had access to funding without accountability. But I'd learned too much about the dynamics that had allowed the deception to continue for so long. The family was going to have to figure out a new way to function, one based on honesty and realistic expectations rather than emotional manipulation and elaborate lies. Whether Lisa would eventually accept these new realities remained to be seen, but I wasn't going to compromise my boundaries while waiting to find out. 3 months passed in this new normal. Mom and Dad had settled into the transparent financial arrangement. sending me detailed information about their expenses and genuinely appreciating the help I could provide within reasonable limits. Dad's actual health was fine, just the normal aging stuff you'd expect from someone in his 70s, nothing requiring expensive treatments or interventions. I'd almost started to believe that Lisa was going to stick with her decision to maintain distance rather than accept accountability. She'd been completely absent from family phone calls, hadn't responded to any of my attempts to reach out, and seemed committed to proving that she didn't need anyone's help or approval. Then, on a Tuesday evening in March, my phone rang with Lisa's number. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken directly since our argument about financial transparency, and I wasn't sure I was ready for another confrontation. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up on the fourth ring. Her voice sounded different, less defensive, more tired than I'd heard her in years. She asked if we could really talk, without the anger and accusations that had dominated our last conversation. Something in her tone made me agree to listen, though I kept my expectations low. The story that came out over the next hour was both surprising and completely predictable. Lisa's lifestyle upgrade had been unsustainable from the beginning, built entirely on the money she'd been receiving through the fake medical crisis. When that funding stopped, her financial house of cards had started collapsing almost immediately. The Honda Civic she'd been so proud of was leased, not purchased, with monthly payments that consumed most of her retail income. The nicer apartment came with rent that was twice what she'd been paying before. The clothes, restaurant meals, and weekend trips had all been funded by money that was supposed to be helping Dad's non-existent medical treatment. Without my monthly contributions, Lisa had been scrambling to maintain her new lifestyle, using credit cards and small loans from friends. But that strategy had a built-in expiration date, and she was rapidly approaching it. The lease payments were behind, the credit cards were maxed out, and she was facing the prospect of having to drastically downsize her life. The most frustrating part of her explanation was that she still seemed to view this as a temporary setback rather than a consequence of her own choices. She talked about needing to get back on her feet, as if her previous financial situation had been stable and sustainable rather than entirely dependent on deception and manipulation. But then came the part that really caught me off guard. Lisa admitted that she'd been wrong about the lying, that she should have just asked for help directly instead of creating an elaborate medical crisis to justify her requests. She acknowledged that her approach had damaged trust and hurt everyone involved, including Dad, who'd been unknowingly used as a prop in her scheme. This was the first time since the whole situation had exploded that Lisa had taken real responsibility for her actions rather than trying to justify them or shift blame to others. It was a complete transformation. She still seemed more focused on the practical consequences than the emotional impact, but it was progress. Then came the request I hadn't expected. Lisa asked if I'd be willing to help her get out of the financial hole she'd created, specifically by helping with the remaining payments on the Honda Civic lease. She owed about $30,000 over the remaining term, and defaulting would destroy her credit and potentially leave her without transportation to work. My first instinct was to say no immediately. This felt like the same pattern as before. Lisa making poor financial decisions, and then expecting family members to bail her out when the consequences became uncomfortable. Why should I clean up a mess that she created through her own choices? But as we continued talking, I realized the situation was actually different in some important ways. Lisa was being honest about what the money would be used for and why she needed it. She was acknowledging her mistakes rather than trying to justify them. And most importantly, she was asking for help rather than manipulating circumstances to make help seem mandatory. She also proposed terms that showed she understood the gravity of what she was asking. Lisa offered to move back to a cheaper apartment, return to a more modest lifestyle, and provide regular updates on her financial situation. She even suggested setting up a formal repayment plan, though we both knew her income made that unrealistic in the short term. I told her I needed time to think about it. This wasn't just about the money. It was about whether I believed Lisa had actually learned something from this experience or was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild overnight just because someone apologizes and promises to do better. Over the next week, I found myself genuinely conflicted. Part of me wanted to help because Lisa was still my sister, and watching family members struggle financially when you have the means to help feels terrible. But another part of me worried that bailing her out would just enable future poor decisions and reinforce the idea that family members would always clean up her messes. I decided to test Lisa's commitment to change by proposing terms that would be genuinely inconvenient for her. If she wanted help with the car payments, she'd have to provide monthly financial statements showing her income and expenses. She'd have to move to a cheaper apartment within 60 days. And she'd have to attend financial planning, counseling to develop better money management skills. These weren't punitive measures. They were practical steps that would help ensure she didn't end up in the same situation again. But they also required Lisa to accept ongoing accountability and make real changes to her lifestyle, which would demonstrate whether her remorse was genuine or just strategic. To my surprise, Lisa agreed to all of these conditions without argument. She seemed to understand that rebuilding trust will require more than just words and promises. She had to prove through her actions that she'd learned from her mistakes and was committed to making better choices going forward. I agreed to help with the Honda Civic payments, but structured as a series of monthly contributions rather than a lump sum. This would give me ongoing visibility into whether Lisa was keeping her commitments and make it easier to stop the assistance if she reverted to her previous patterns. The arrangement has been working for the past 6 months. Lisa moved to a much more modest apartment, provided detailed monthly financial reports, and completed a financial planning course at the local community college. She's been living within her actual income rather than depending on external funding to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. More importantly, our relationship has started to rebuild on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation. Lisa seems to understand that trust has to be earned back gradually, and she's been willing to accept the accountability measures that make ongoing help possible. So there you have it. My story about discovering that my father's medical crisis was completely fake, and how we rebuilt family relationships after that trust was shattered. It wasn't the ending I expected when this whole thing started, but it turned out better than I could have hoped. What do you think about this situation? Have you ever dealt with family members who use deception to get financial help? I'm curious to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me continue sharing these real-life stories. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.